Hey everybody, welcome back to another video. This is the first video in a new series that we're going to be starting called the Happiness Series. And this series is basically going to be breaking down different ideas and strategies that you can utilize in your everyday life to help mitigate as much stress as possible and ultimately live a happier and healthier life. So I hope you enjoy it. My name is Dr. Matthew Shem. I'm the owner of Peak Brain Performance Centers here in Colorado Springs. And basically what we're going to be doing is breaking down this gentleman's work here that he wrote about in this book entitled The Happiness Advantage. His name is Shawn Achor. And what's really interesting about this guy is that he was actually approached by an officer of Harvard University who ended up hiring him to live on campus and then help students navigate the difficult path of both academic success as well as just everyday happiness. And he also helped design and teach a class at Harvard called Positive Psychology. And he starts the book by talking about this broken formula that we're all taught to believe that if we put our nose to the grindstone and we work really hard now, we will end up being successful and therefore happier in some distant future. And the problem is that we think that if I can just get that raise, lose that 10 pounds, buy that car, find that special someone, or whatever it is that you're putting on that podium, then and only then will I be happy. And the unfortunate reality is that if that was truly the case, then every person who achieved any goal of any kind should, at least in theory, be happy. But the problem is that with each accomplishment, the goalpost for success ends up just getting pushed further and further, and your standards just become higher. And so too, your happiness ends up always just being right out of reach. And so in this study, what they found was that as many as 4 out of 5 Harvard students suffer from depression at least once during their school year, and nearly half of all students suffer from depression so debilitating that they can't function. And then in regards to employment, this says that 45% of workers surveyed were happy with their job, the lowest in 22 years of polling, and this was as of 2010. This means that the majority of people are not satisfied or at least unfulfilled by their occupation. Another alarming statistic is that depression rates today, and today was in 2002, they're 10 times higher than they were in the 1960s. So what's really alarming about that is that 50 years ago, the mean onset age of depression was 29 and a half. Today, it's almost exactly half of that at 14 and a half. And what's mind-blowing to me, I think, is that if we were to look at things objectively, we are at the most exciting time in history. If we think about the technical advancements that we've seen just over my lifetime, it's mind-blowing to see how far things have come in just the last 2 decades. Medical advancements alone are astonishing, and seeing the capability of how long people are living today versus, let's say, 100 years ago, mind-blowing, right? So many of life's inconveniences can now be mitigated, and yet somehow, as a nation, the rates of depression are still on the rise. And one question that the author gets in this book is that, why would you want to study Harvard students? Because at least in theory, these are probably going to be just rich, privileged kids who are seeking higher education from a very prestigious university. And so your first thought when studying happiness, or maybe even the lack thereof, probably wouldn't be Harvard students, right? But if you actually take a moment to look back and you imagine one of these students, many of them have been working their whole primary education years, maybe even prior to that, to get into the position they are in today. They have gotten used to being in the top 1% of their class and the top 1% of all standardized testing that they've taken along the way to get to the position that they're in today. They probably won awards and broken records, and then all of a sudden they walk into Harvard, they pass that threshold, and now 50% of them are now below average. And so with so much pressure to be great, it's no surprise that whenever these kids fall, they're obviously going to fall pretty hard. And this book is Shawn, the author's work, in seeking out those 1 in 5 students who are truly happy and flourishing and trying to find exactly what is giving them that advantage over their peers. A couple quotes that he talks about in the first chapter that I thought were really cool is he says, if we study merely what is average, we will remain merely average. You can study gravity. He also said, you can study gravity forever without ever learning how to fly. And why this is really important is because conventional psychology up to today has traditionally ignored the outliers because they don't fit their pattern, of the pattern that they're seeking to find. In this book, the author seeks to do the exact opposite. Instead of deleting the outliers, he wants to learn from them. Throughout history, we tend to focus on those who fall only on the below average side of things. Now, of course, the ones that fall below average in regards to happiness are probably the ones that need the most help and need to be relieved of, let's say, depression or substance abuse, maybe chronic stress or whatever it may be. And while I think that that is definitely important, you can obviously cure depression without ever making someone truly happy. So if all we do is strive to eliminate the bad, you'll only achieve average, and then you'll miss out on the opportunity to exceed the average, which I think is what we all want to strive for, right? And so last thing, tying everything up here in the first video, I want to give you a couple examples because I can already tell that there's going to be some people as we go through this series, if they make it through the whole series, and they're going to say, well, those are really cool principles, but that probably works for people who are already happy, or the old, you can't teach an old dog new tricks or things like that. And the reality is that change is possible. And so the first study I'll tell you about is a study that they did with squirrel monkeys, where they're locked in this cage, an empty cage, as a matter of fact. And to survive, these monkeys have to consume 240 pellets of food every hour, but it's very difficult to be able to grab each pellet of food because they're located in a really small hole just right outside of the cage. And so initially, it takes 30 seconds to retrieve each pellet. And if they can't figure out how to complete the task any faster, they will starve and die. And after about 500 tries, the monkeys become better at retrieving the pellets, even as the size of the hole continually decreases in size, making things a little bit more difficult. And what's really interesting is that they placed electrodes on these monkeys' brains, and what they found was that by the end of the experiment, the area within the brain that was responsible for accomplishing this task had expanded. And they also make a point within the study to emphasize that this change didn't happen over many, many generations. It was one experiment over a few month time span. And what's also important to emphasize is that this particular study was performed on monkeys, but recent studies have also shown identical outcomes in humans. And what I love about that is that this study just goes to show what I get to witness firsthand every day while working with patients, because the unfortunate reality is that most patients that make their way to see me and make their way to my office, they've oftentimes been struggling for many years. And regardless of the time that has passed since their injury, we can usually make some substantial improvements in a relatively short period of time if I decide to take on that case. And so I just thought that was really interesting. And then the second study that I'll tell you about is some researchers who were studying the brains of taxi cab drivers in London. And what they found were that these cab drivers' hippocampi, the brain region involved in spatial memory, was larger than the average person. And to actually learn more about this, the author of the book went to London to find out more. And so whenever he got there, he went and talked with the cab driver, who explained that unlike traditional cities where the roads are based on a grid system, London's not like that at all. It's basically one big maze. And so it goes to show that, or the question now becomes, from birth, do some people's genes develop a larger brain region because they know that they will one day find it useful? So for example, with these cab drivers, did their genes just inherently know that one day you're going to become a cab driver and you're probably going to you're going to need this larger region of your brain, so let's just give that to you now? Or does it increase in size as a result of our actions and circumstances? And hopefully you can kind of tease that out and figure out which one makes the more sense. But obviously it's the second one, right? And so I hope that you enjoyed that. And this was just the first video to get your feet a little bit wet. And the next video will actually start diving into the more tactical information about things that you can do to ultimately live a happier and healthier life. So if you have any questions, feel free to email me or give my office a call, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.